Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into a creaky, flea-bitten bed stuffed with straw in a room with no heat, shared with your cousins, a goat, and probably a monk who snores. You'll pull your cloak tighter and tuck your toes under a wooden board meant to keep them from freezing off. But don't worry, you won't be here long. You'll wake up around midnight, because that's how people used to sleep. Welcome to the strange and sleep-interrupted world of the Middle Ages. The night isn't a single stretch. It's a rhythm, broken in half like a loaf of coarse rye bread. You settle into your first sleep as the last glimmer of sunlight fades. It's not even late, just a few hours after dusk. In a world without electric light, nighttime begins early and stretches long. So the solution? Break it up. You doze off quickly, lulled by the scent of tallow smoke and the distant bleating of livestock. Your body, already exhausted from a day of hauling water and trying not to be accused of witchcraft, gives in. But after 4 hours or so, your eyes snap open. No emergency. No noise. Just awake. This isn't insomnia. This is completely normal. The first sleep and second sleep model dominated Europe for centuries. People expected to wake around midnight. It wasn't a disruption, it was opportunity. Time to pray, read if you were literate, mend things, tend a fire, or if you were lucky enough to have a partner, well, let's just say there was a reason so many babies were conceived around midnight. Some even went outside. Historians still argue whether these midnight strolls were common or exceptional. But there are plenty of written references to people wandering moonlit gardens or chatting with neighbors in the dark. It sounds kind of romantic until you remember the moonlight often included howling dogs, lurking rats, and the occasional corpse cart. Still, your second sleep waits. Eventually, you feel the weight of tiredness creep back in. You curl into the same position as before. There's no down pillow, just a stuffed sack of whatever scraps you could find, and drift off again. This second sleep feels different, deeper, dreamier. Maybe your body knew what it was doing all along. Modern scientists even suspect that broken sleep patterns might be more natural for humans. Those weird wake-up-at-3-a.m. nights you sometimes get now might just be your medieval instincts kicking in. Sorry about that. Imagine you've finished tending to your embers, whispered a few prayers, adjusted your woolen blanket, and now you're easing back into dreamland, where hopefully nothing demonic shows up. More on that in a few sections. The rooster won't crow for a few hours yet, and your landlord's son hasn't started banging pots. There's peace here, brief and dim and wrapped in smoke, but peace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You curl up tighter now, one arm beneath your head, the other holding your cloak closed at the chest. Sleep is returning. Outside, the stars are pinpricks behind clouds. Inside, the world is quiet, except for the occasional whisper from another bed across the room. You're already halfway to your second dream when the first bell of matins rings in the monastery tower down the road. The moment you enter a medieval bedroom, you can tell exactly how important the person is without them saying a word. You just glance at the bed. If it's a hay-filled sack on the floor beside the hearth, you're probably dealing with a servant or a child. But if it's a towering wooden structure carved with vines, saints, and maybe the family crest, with thick curtains to keep the cold out and the snooping eyes away, congratulations, you've stumbled into the boudoir of someone who's either incredibly wealthy, incredibly noble, or both. In medieval times, a bed wasn't just where you slept, it was where you displayed power. Beds were heirlooms. They were handed down, celebrated in wills, sometimes dragged around from estate to estate, like mobile thrones. One duchess supposedly brought her own bed with her when visiting friends just to make sure she wouldn't have to suffer the indignity of sleeping like the common folk. A well-off person's bed had a canopy, not to be fancy, although let's be honest, it was, but to catch thatch debris falling from the poorly sealed roof. Stray twigs, the occasional bug, maybe even a mouse. Very romantic. Then there were the hangings. Heavy cloth drapes that could be drawn close to keep warmth in and curious servants out. In a castle or nobleman's home, you'd often find the lord and lady's bed tucked away in an alcove or even behind a screen. Privacy, after all, was rare, especially when your household included 30 retainers, 10 visiting knights, and a court jester who never seemed to sleep. Historians still argue whether servants routinely stood in bedrooms overnight, or if that was reserved for moments of ceremony and illness. Either way, beds were never truly private. Even royal beds doubled as spaces for meetings, meals, and very awkward diplomatic conversations in NIGHTCLOTH. Now, you probably don't own a feather mattress made from plucked goose down, stitched by nuns, and blessed by a bishop. More likely, you'd be on a lumpy wool-filled pad, if you're lucky, stuffed with whatever your town had lying around: straw, moss, sheep's fleece. Some poorer households used old clothing scraps. Think of it like medieval memory foam, except it remembers every sneeze and sweat stain. The frame? If you had one at all, it might just be rope crisscrossed beneath the mattress. Sleep too long without tightening it, and you'd sag right into the floorboards. That's where the phrase "sleep tight" supposedly comes from. Tighten those ropes before bedtime. Bonus tip: don't think too hard about what might be crawling between the cracks. Even the height of the bed mattered. Aristocrats slept high up, climbing in with the help of a stool. Peasants, meanwhile, rolled straight onto floor-level pallets, often next to the oven, if they were lucky enough to live in a home with one. And it's not just the structure, it's the people in it. The grandest beds were built to be seen. When visitors arrived, they'd often be shown into the Lord's chamber, not to be nosy, but because it doubled as a reception area. You might be talking politics while perched on the edge of his marital mattress. No pressure. And what about the linens? Nobles owned layer sheets, woollen blankets, embroidered covers. Some even perfumed them with dried herbs or rosewater. Meanwhile, hasn't maybe one itchy woolen throw, maybe not. Either way, you slept with your feet sticking out if you grew too tall, which, let's face it, was unlikely in a world where nutrition came second to avoiding plague. Beds, then, were as symbolic as they were functional. They told stories of wealth, family, intimacy, and if you listened closely enough, just how many generations had been born, wed, and buried beneath those same wooden beams. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine your bed not as just a place to sleep, but as the centerpiece of your medieval identity. Whether it's creaking on hempen rope or towering with brocade, it's where your dreams and your legacy collide. You don't undress for bed. Not really. Maybe you remove your belt, maybe your shoes, if it's not winter. But your nightwear is the same shapeless linen shift you wore to market that morning, and you're keeping it on. Because warmth matters more than modesty, and lice don't care about your bedtime routine. Sleeping fully clothed was the norm across most of medieval Europe, not because people didn't want to relax, but because they couldn't afford to get cold. Nights where bitter homes were drafty, and central heating was still about 6 centuries away. So you keep your tunic, your hose, even your hat if you have one, especially if you're bald, which statistically you probably are. Layering wasn't optional, it was survival. You might even sleep in your cloak, pulled over your chest like a blanket. And if you're lucky enough to own fur, that too joins the pile, no matter how many fleas it brings along. Sleep hygiene meets sleep realism. And speaking of fleas, don't get too cozy. Your bedding is probably alive. Lice, bedbugs, the occasional flea circus, even kings scratched. You might try sprinkling herbs, lavender, rosemary, pennyroyal under the sheets to ward them off. But let's be honest, the herbs mostly make your bed smell like seasoned bread. The bugs don't mind that now. It's not that no one ever changed clothes. The very wealthy had designated nightshirts, often white linen, sometimes embroidered, though mostly for show. A few might even bathe before bed, but that's for a future section. For most people, though, the idea of stripping down before sleep was about as practical as inviting a goose to a wedding. It just didn't happen, and remember, it's not just you in bed. Your spouse, your kids, maybe your apprentice, if you're a tradesman, maybe your grandmother. In cities, entire families sometimes shared a single room, and when space got tight, you doubled up, or tripled, or quadrupled. Historians still argue whether people really slept like this every night, or whether they rotated sleeping arrangements like strange nocturnal Tetris. Some accounts describe hot beds, where one person sleeps while the other works the night shift, then they swap. Not exactly the most restful setup, but efficient. There are stories of travelers arriving at inns and being told, "Yes, we have room in that bed," with that stranger. Inns charged by the spot, not the room. You could sleep next to someone you'd never met. Maybe they were drunk, maybe they snored, maybe they had the plague. You'd find out by morning dot, and when you do wake up groggy and rumpled, there's no shower, no toothbrush, no fresh pajamas to change into. You rise in the same clothes, slightly sweatier and possibly more lice-ridden than the day before, and get moving. That's the rhythm. That's the world. There's a strange kind of comfort in this, once you let go of the idea that cleanliness is next to godliness. For medieval folks, cleanliness was a luxury and a controversial one. But warmth was sacred. So you layered and huddled and didn't risk removing your clothes unless the bed was burning. Maybe in your next dream you'll drift to a time when people had flannel and memory foam. For now, just keep your boots by the bed and your shirt tucked close. Oh, and if something starts crawling up your leg, just pretend it's a blessing from St. Cuthbert. He was known to be patient. It's night, real night, cold, deep, damp. There's no central heating, no insulation, no double-glazed windows, whispering promises of comfort. Just stone walls that sweat and wooden beams that creak, groaning like tired bones. You sleep in a house that leaks winter through every crack and forget thermostats. The temperature in your bedroom is whatever the weather feels like offering. You pull your cloak tighter. Maybe you even tuck your feet under the dog lying at the foot of the bed, if you're lucky enough to own one. Dogs, cats, even livestock sometimes made their way into human sleeping spaces, not for affection, but for warmth. You might be surprised by how cozy a pig can be when your toes are going numb. That's not an exaggeration. In rural households, especially, pigs and goats often shared the ground floor. The family might sleep in a loft above the animals, separated by some boards and the occasional prayer. The rising body heat from below made those sleeping quarters just warm enough to keep your breath from freezing midder. Mostly Dot, of course. Not everyone had livestock heaters, so you layered. Wool under linen, linen under more wool. Some wore 2 or 3 hats. The more inventive stuffed straw between garments. It worked, sort of, Dot. And then there were the bedfellows. You didn't just share beds out of necessity. You shared them because sleeping alone in an unheated room could be dangerous. Hypothermia wasn't a medical term back then, but it was very much a reality. So you cuddled. You didn't talk about it. You just did it. Even monks slept side by side in drafty dormitories, and nobility, despite their massive canopy beds, sometimes invited in children or servants on especially bitter nights. A warm body was a warm body. You light a candle. It flickers, the flame battling the chill. Maybe you have a small brazier in the corner, fed with precious coals, but it's risky. More than one household burned down because someone fell asleep, with the embers still glowing. Fire brings warmth and fear. Historians still debate whether people acclimated to the cold better than we do now, or whether they simply suffered in silence. Maybe both. There are records of people sleeping in fur-lined sleeping sacks, not unlike primitive sleeping bags, but only the wealthy could afford such luxuries. For the rest, frostbite wasn't an if, it was a when. Dot. And then, of course, there's the midnight pee problem. Cold rooms make bladders twitchy. You know you need to go, but the floor is freezing. The chamber pot is across the room, and you really don't want to wake your bedmates, human or otherwise. So you debate, wait, or risk it. You make a move. Your bare foot touches the icy floor, and you instantly regret everything. You shuffle quickly, teeth clenched, hoping not to trip over the dog or knock over the stool. Dot. Eventually, you crawl back under the layers, feeling your way toward the warm dent your body left behind. It's still there, just barely. Dot. This is where dreams start to feel different. Not gentle, storybook dreams, but strange, flickering ones. Cold seems to invite the uncanny. People often described seeing things at night, ghosts, saints, demons. More on that soon. But it's no coincidence that many of these visions came when temperatures dropped and the mind danced between sleep and shivers. Still, the cold had its rituals. People warmed stones in the hearth and placed them in the bed. Some used heated bricks wrapped in cloth. Others drank hot ale or mulled wine before sleeping, chasing off the chill with a little buzz. And some monks, especially simply, accepted the suffering as a spiritual gift. Cold kept you humble. Cold kept you alert. Cold kept you close to God. You pull your knees up to your chest and listen. The wind hums through the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howls, or maybe it's a wolf. Hard to tell, but for now, you're still warm enough, still breathing, still drifting. Silence is something you take for granted today. White noise machines, closed windows, maybe a quiet playlist humming in the background. But in a medieval household, silence was an impossible luxury. Especially at night, you're not alone. Even if you live in a castle. Maybe especially if you live in a castle. Let's start with the basics. Homes were communal. Even if your family was wealthy, you didn't get your own soundproofed suite. You might sleep in the same room as cousins, retainers, visiting knights, and maybe a falcon or two in the corner. The idea of everyone retreating to separate bedrooms each evening, that's modern. Back then, it was more like a slumber party, except with lice and a 3% survival rate dot in monasteries. The situation was even more intimate. Picture a long hall lined with wooden cots, dozens of monks lying side by side in itchy habits, murmuring Latin prayers or softly snoring. No one got up to hush Brother Matthew if he let one rip in his sleep. You just rolled over and prayed harder. Noise was constant. Wind rattling shutters, dogs barking, rats scrabbling in the beams. Church bells clanging at all hours to mark the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime. You just fall asleep, and then dawn. Time to wake up and chant. Again, historians still argue whether people ever truly adapted to these sounds, or whether they simply learned to tune them out through exhaustion. Some suggest they embraced the rhythm. Others think the average medieval person just walked around perpetually sleep-deprived. Honestly, both seem true. And then there were the inns. You traveled to another town, hoping for a bed, a roof, and maybe a bowl of turnip stew. What you get is a straw pallet on the common room floor next to 6 strangers and a goat. The goat smells better than 2 of the strangers. Someone snores. Someone coughs. Someone mumbles in a language you don't understand. You try to sleep. Anyway, if you're staying at a noble's manor as a guest, things are a little better. Maybe you get a trundle bed pushed under the Lord's own. But privacy, still a fantasy. Curtains might block the light, but they do nothing for the sound of 2 knights arguing about tournament results at 2 a.m. or a servant emptying a chamber pot with all the subtlety of a waterfall. Even natural sounds were louder. Without insulation, thatch roofs amplified every gust of wind, every patter of rain. Thunder sounded like Judgment Day. And if you lived near a forest, the nighttime chorus of owls, wolves, and God knows what added a little spice to bedtime anxiety. Want to block it out? Tough. Earplugs wouldn't be invented for centuries. Some people stuffed bits of cloth in their ears or covered their heads entirely with blankets. But if you did that too well, you'd wake up gasping. A fair trade that occasionally things got musical. Traveling minstrels weren't above performing deep into the night if someone paid them enough. Drunken singing from nearby taverns drifted through windows, and festivals could stretch into dawn, with fiddles screeching and tambourines jangling, well past sanity. And yet amid the chaos there was comfort. Noise meant life, the hiss of the fire, the creak of a bed, the soft breathing of someone close by. You learned to anchor yourself to these sounds, to let them rock you like waves. Sleep didn't demand silence. It just needed rhythm. So tonight, as you listen to your own surroundings, maybe the hum of traffic, the buzz of a fridge, imagine you're lying on a straw pallet in a stone hall, with 5 other bodies sharing your breath and someone's elbow poking your rib. You breathe in, out. The world is noisy, but sleep, it comes anyway. It's crowded in here. You can barely move, not because the room is small, though it probably is, but because you're sharing the bed with at least one person, often more, maybe a sibling, maybe 2, maybe a traveling stranger who paid the innkeeper a penny to bunk beside you. In the medieval world, beds weren't personal. They were practical. And if you wanted to sleep, you had to accept company. Forget the idea of a double bed or a twin. Most common folk slept on broad mattresses if they had one, or sacks of straw large enough to squeeze in whoever needed a place to rest. There were no guest rooms. There were just beds, and everyone shared. For families it made sense. Heat, safety, closeness. Parents slept with children. Grandparents with grandchildren. Infants tucked between adults for warmth. Privacy? That wasn't a concept people obsessed over. If you wanted to talk in secret, you waited for a walk in the woods, not after dark, under 5 blankets and beside a snoring uncle. Even among the elite, bed sharing wasn't taboo. Kings often slept with their courtiers, not romantically, just ritually. A trusted servant might sleep at the foot of the royal bed in case His Majesty needed water, a cloak, or, protection from assassination, because that was a real concern. There's a reason so many medieval beds had high curtains and locks on the bedchamber doors. In monasteries, monks slept side by side in dormitories called dormitoriums, rows of beds, sometimes even just mats. Silence was enforced, but the smell wasn't. You learned to breathe shallowly, or to pray harder. Historians still debate how common stranger sharing really was. Did people really let travelers curl up in their beds? Or is that an exaggeration from chroniclers trying to prove how hospitable their people were? But we know it happened. There are records from inns describing shared arrangements, complaints about bedmates who stank most foul, and even legal disputes over bed space. Imagine taking someone to court because they stole the blanket. And speaking of blankets, don't expect one each. There might be a single woolen cover for 3 bodies. You learn to negotiate quietly, because the last thing you want at midnight is a tug of war over half a foot of frayed linen. Sleeping with others also meant negotiating posture. One person sprawls, one curls. One snores directly into your eardrum. If someone gets up to use the chamber pot, you wake. If someone coughs, sneezes, or groans from a bad dream, you wake. And yet somehow, through the warmth and the clutter, you still manage to sleep. Sometimes there's joy in the crowd. Children giggling under blankets, whispered stories in the dark, quiet prayers said in rhythm. You bond through breath and body heat. You learn unconsciously to match someone else's breathing until your own becomes soft and steady dot and ends. The bed-sharing system wasn't about comfort. It was about economy. The landlord charged by the space. You could share with a merchant, a pilgrim, a soldier on leave. In one infamous case, a man fell asleep beside a thief and woke up with nothing but the fleas. But it wasn't always bad. Many travelers described bonding over these night-long encounters, sharing food, stories, maybe even a blanket. In a world that prized community over privacy, sleep was one more opportunity to connect. Of course, there were limits. If you were really rich, you might own multiple beds, but even then, you rarely slept alone. A noblewoman might share her bed with her ladies-in-waiting. A nobleman with his favored servant or valet. Sleeping alone, ironically, was seen as suspicious. What were you hiding? Who were you avoiding? Tonight, as you roll to one side, imagine there's someone right beside you, knees knocking, breath warm. Maybe it's your cousin. Maybe a stranger with very cold feet. You don't mind. You're used to it. You shift. You breathe. Sleep, even in a crowded bed, is possible. You just need to find your corner. You wake in the dark, a familiar pressure low in your belly. You know what that means. Time to pee. Unfortunately, your bathroom is right there, in the room, in the corner. And a pot. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval nighttime relief. The chamber pot, humble, essential, occasionally decorative. For the average medieval sleeper, this was your best and only friend when nature called after sundown. You didn't traipse outside to the latrine or garden. That meant frostbitten toes, dangerous alleys, and probably stepping in something worse than what you were about to contribute. So instead, you shuffle across the cold floorboards, blindly feeling your way past bedmates, cloaks, maybe a stray chicken. You locate the pot, squat or hover, and do your best to avoid splashing. No one pretended this was elegant, but it was efficient. And considering how many people were crammed into sleeping quarters, it was also deeply awkward. Families often shared one pot. Yes, one. That meant if you had to go and someone else had just gone, well, let's just say you didn't breathe through your nose, and emptying it, that was someone's unfortunate job in the morning. Usually the youngest, or the apprentice, or whoever lost the morning argument, the noise. Oh yes, everyone heard it. There was no running water to muffle your efforts. Just the slosh of liquid and clay, the slight grunt of effort, maybe even a relieved sigh, all in full audio. And you wonder why people invented lullabies. Now, if you were noble, your experience came with more flair. You might have a chamber pot shaped like a swan, or lined with pewter. Or if you were royalty, you had a close stool, a wooden box with a padded seat, basically a medieval toilet throne, sometimes even attended by a personal servant called the groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real job title. Yes, he was highly respected. Yes, that says everything about the Middle Ages. Still, even kings didn't like getting up in the cold. So the chamber pot, royal or not, remained a nighttime fixture, tucked discreetly under the bed, or proudly in the corner, depending on the household's humility levels. Historians still argue whether people kept separate pots for solids and liquids, or if that's just wishful thinking. Evidence is spotty, but safe to assume. One pot, many uses, Minimal rinsing. In monasteries, monks had to follow strict routines, even in the bathroom department. Many abbeys had scheduled toilet times, but if a brother had to relieve himself during the night, he used a pot in the dormitory, quietly or tried to. But with 20 men on wooden planks, silence was aspirational at best. Some wealthier townsfolk might have had night jars with lids, or pots scented with herbs like mint or chamomile to help mask the odor. Nice try. It helped for 5 minutes. Tops. Now imagine you're a traveler. You've secured a sleeping spot in a crowded inn. The floor is packed. The beds are full. It's dark. You can't see the pot, but you know it's somewhere. You pray that your foot doesn't find it before your hand does, because if you knock it over ... let single quotes not think about that ... There are even stories of people relieving themselves in the fireplace when they couldn't reach the pot. Desperate times. Bad judgment. Warm stones. For women, things were more complicated. In public spaces, they sometimes used a device called a bordalua, small, boat-shaped pot, discreetly placed under skirts. But at night, unless you had one of these fancy gadgets, it was the same as the men. Hike up your shift, squat, hope for the best. And after, no toilet paper. Maybe a rag, maybe moss, maybe nothing. Depends on how fancy you are feeling and how much daylight would be involved in laundry tomorrow. Tonight. As you shift under your covers, imagine that simple relief isn't so simple. That every midnight trip is a minor expedition. That privacy is a joke, and dignity ... optional ... and yet you survive. Everyone did, because chamber pots weren't gross, they were normal. Part of the rhythm, like snoring, or firewood popping, or someone rolling over and muttering in their sleep. You drift again, relieved and a little more grateful for modern plumbing. You're finally asleep again, or at least trying to be. But something feels off. It's not the cold. It's not the fleas. It's not even the distant creak of someone using the chamber pot. It's something else. You feel a weight pressing on your chest. You can't move. The air grows thick. And then, just for a second, you're sure you saw something at the foot of your bed. Congratulations, you've just had a medieval nightmare. And the thing is, people back then didn't call it a dream. They called it a visitation. In the Middle Ages, sleep was a sacred, terrifying, and utterly unpredictable place. Because when you drifted off, you didn't just rest. You opened yourself up to the unseen. Dreams could be messages from God or tricks from demons. Sometimes both. One of the most common sleep-related fears was sleep paralysis, though they didn't have that term for it yet. Instead, they blamed it on supernatural forces. A night hag, a succubus, a demon sitting on your chest. People described the sensation with eerie accuracy. Waking in the dark, unable to move, gasping for air, a heavy weight pinning them down. They believed it was an evil spirit trying to steal your soul, or worse. Historians still argue whether these visions were tied to illness, stress, or sleeping in freezing, uncomfortable positions, but there's no denying that sleep came bundled with fear. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were omens. A knight might dream of a serpent and be convinced it foretold betrayal. A peasant might see fire and assume his barn was doomed. Clerics kept dream journals, trying to decipher divine warnings. There were even dream books guides that interpreted symbols, telling you exactly what it meant if you dreamed of a dog, a fish, or your teeth falling out. A spoiler, none of it was good, but it wasn't always fear. Some dreams were seen as holy visions. Saints, especially, were believed to visit the sleeping faithful. A nun might dream of the Virgin Mary handing her a rose and wake with tears streaming down her face. A monk might dream of purgatory and use it as a sermon starter for the next 20 years. Sleep wasn't escape, it was divine communication. Of course. Not everyone bought into this. Some physicians thought dreams were just the byproduct of digestion. Eat too much cabbage and your dreams get weird. Logical, honestly. But for most people, the line between real and dream was blurry. If you woke sweating, heart racing, and couldn't shake the feeling that something had touched you, you didn't dismiss it. You lit a candle. You said a prayer. You might even sprinkle holy water on the bed. Some went further. Iron nails driven into the bed frame. Garlic hung at the windows. Special symbols chalked above the headboard to ward off evil. These were acts of nighttime defense, spiritual sleep hygiene, medieval edition. People feared that evil could enter through dreams, that your soul wandered while your body slept. And if it didn't come back, that's how stories of soul stealing, demons took root. In one French village, it was believed that witches could enter your room as wisps of smoke and ride your sleeping body like a horse. If you woke with sore muscles and strange bruises, well, better see the local priest. It wasn't all demons, though. Sometimes people dreamed of the dead, relatives offering cryptic advice, lost children saying goodbye, lovers visiting one last time. These weren't just dreams, they were visitations, and they were taken seriously. People changed wills because of dreams, canceled journeys, broke engagements. Tonight, if you find yourself dreaming, you might walk through a misty field and meet someone with familiar eyes, or see a distant castle on fire, or feel the chill of breath on your neck. But don't panic. It's just a dream. Probably you adjust your blanket. Whisper a quiet prayer, even if you're not religious. Just in case. And then you sleep again, a little warier, but still willing to risk it. Because dreams, even scary ones, are part of the night's rhythm. And in the medieval world, rhythm was everything. The bells start tolling in the distance again, your barely awake eyes crusted, limbs stiff, but the rhythm of monastery life waits for no one. And if you're a monk, a nun, or even just living near one, the night is far from over. Because in medieval life, sleep was scheduled, carefully, relentlessly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes miserably. Let's start in the monastery. If you've taken holy orders, your sleep isn't your own. The day and night belong to God. You sleep in short shifts, broken by bells that summon you to prayer. The first comes at midnight or just after, matins, the night office. You and the other monks rise, groggy but obedient, and shuffle silently into the church. Robes swishing, candles flickering, cold stone underfoot. You chant, you pray, you try not to yawn. Then you go back to bed for a few hours, if you can. Then at dawn, lauds, another bell, another gathering, another hour lost to worship while the rest of the world still sleeps. This isn't unusual. Monastic life was built around the divine office, 8 periods of prayer, day, and night. And though most people didn't follow this rigid pattern, the spiritual world still echoed in their sleep. Farmers heard the bells. Townsfolk woke with the sunrise church call. Everyone's sleep was shaped in some way by faith and sound. Historians still debate how strictly these hours were observed in different communities, especially during harsh winters when getting out of bed meant frostbite. Some abbeys allowed brothers to sleep through certain prayers if they were ill or elderly. Others, no mercy. God came first, even if you were half asleep by supper. Outside the monasteries, sleep varied wildly. A castle might hum at midnight with quiet footsteps, guards changing shifts, servants stoking fires. Nobles might be up for midnight prayer or private reflection, especially during periods of mourning or illness. A night watchman might patrol the grounds, lantern in hand, cloak drawn tight, listening for signs of intrusion or ghosts dot in cities. The town gates closed at sundown, and night watchmen took to the streets. Their job? Keep fires from spreading, chase off thieves, and yes, sometimes wake people if needed. Some even called the hours aloud like a human clock. Midnight and all is well. Useful, unless you were trying to sleep. And peasants? Well, they rose early. The cock didn't just crow for fun. If you had fields to tend or bread to bake, dawn wasn't a poetic hour, it was the start of hard labor. Many households rose well before sunrise to light the fire, grind grain, feed animals, and prep for the day ahead. Some people took naps to cope. Afternoon naps, often after the midday meal, were common, especially in hot climates. Pilgrims sometimes napped in churches. Shepherds dozed under trees while watching flocks. Even monks had designated rest periods between services. Sleep was flexible. You grabbed it where you could. And let's not forget the professional insomniacs. Night guards, scribes, healers, midwives, blacksmiths on emergency call. These people stayed alert during the dark hours, patching roofs, tending wounds, delivering. Babies by candlelight. One particularly sleepy profession. Watch monks assigned to stay up and guard relics or keep vigil over the dying. Imagine pacing a cold chapel at 2 a.m., whispering prayers while the shadows dance. Peaceful? Maybe. Creepy? Definitely. Still, for all the interruptions, medieval people didn't always resent broken sleep. That midnight wake-up during the first and second sleep rhythm gave them space-time to think, to whisper, to light a candle and be still. Tonight, as the modern world hums steadily around you, imagine a different pattern, one shaped by bells and beasts, one where sleep is a scattered quilt of hours stitched together with prayer, duty, and flickering dreams. You stretch. The wind rattles the shutter. Someone stirs nearby, maybe a nun rolling over, maybe a guard shifting weight, and the world keeps turning, slowly, quietly. You do not wake the noble. That is rule number one in any medieval household that values continued employment, or, keeping your head attached to your body. The noble's bedchamber isn't just a place to sleep. It's a sanctum, a theater. Of ritual, a power stage with velvet curtains and embroidered pillows. And once the lord or lady has retired for the night, their rest becomes a matter of protocol, privacy, and delicate choreography. But here's the twist. Even when they're asleep, they're never quite alone. If you serve a royal or high-ranking noble, chances are your job includes standing silently in their room, just standing, maybe sitting in a corner if you're lucky, maybe on a stool beside the hearth, but always alert, always waiting. Why? Because your master might wake up thirsty, or cold, or suddenly inspired to discuss taxes. So you stay within, reach draped in layers, trying not to shiver or snore. Some nobles employed a valet de chambre, a personal servant who slept nearby, ready to fetch cloaks, warm stones, or chase away rats. Others kept scribes or confessors on hand in case of late-night spiritual emergencies. And in royal households, the sleeping arrangements bordered on a parade dot. Imagine being a French king. You don't just go to bed, you retire. There's a whole ceremony. Attendants undress you, priests offer blessings, the royal bed is inspected, curtains drawn. You might even fall asleep to someone reading aloud scripture, poetry, or if you're feeling spicy, your own decrees. Then there's the famous lever and coucher, the ritual rising and sleeping of French monarchs. Selected courtiers were invited to witness the king getting into and out of bed. It was an honor, a weird, awkward, pajama-clad honor. Historians still argue whether these rituals were truly sacred or just status theater, but either way, they shaped how sleep functioned in the upper crust. Nobility didn't just sleep, they performed it. But what if something went wrong? What if a servant needed to enter the noble's chamber during the night? Well, they better knock, or whisper, or send a page with a very polite excuse, because bursting in unannounced could lead to dismissal, or worse. One story tells of a courtier who startled a sleeping duke, got punched in the face, and was later fined for the offense. The duke? Perfectly blameless, of course. He was resting dot, and yet, despite all the layers of protocol, the noble bedchamber wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes it was the epicenter of gossip, intrigue, even political scheming. A queen might receive letters from a lover under the covers. A prince might hold secret meetings with allies in his antechamber. Curtains weren't just to block the draft, they were perfect for eavesdropping. Some lords even slept with weapons beneath the bed, just in case. After all, the line between bed and battlefield was sometimes surprisingly short. Even nobles feared. The dark dot their beds, though grand, weren't immune to infestation. Bugs didn't respect titles, so royal bed curtains were sometimes dusted with powdered herbs, and feather beds aired out on sunny days like giant, expensive pancakes. Servants might spend hours combing through sheets, looking for unwelcome visitors. Both crawling and human dot tonight. You're none of those servants. You're not polishing the candlesticks. You're not fluffing the goose-down pillows. You're just lying nearby, pretending not to breathe too loudly while the duke snores like a broken bellows. And if he wakes and demands warm wine, you're ready. But if he doesn't, you sit in the stillness, listening to the fire crackle, and wonder what it's like to sleep without fear, without duty, without someone watching from the shadows. For nobles, sleep wasn't restful. It was strategic. And if you were part of their orbit, it was always your job to make sure their slumber remained unbroken, even if it meant losing your own. You're a pilgrim, you're sore, you're soaked. You've just walked 30 miles through mud, over roots, and around suspiciously aggressive geese. All you want now is to lie down and sleep, but you're not checking into a hotel. You're headed straight for the nearest church dot in the medieval world, Churches weren't just houses of worship. They were also, sometimes, houses of rest. Travelers, especially pilgrims, often slept inside chapels, cloisters, or even in the shadow of a saint's shrine. It was common. It was free, and it was just spiritual enough to ease the conscience after a week of questionable choices on the road. Churches were cool, quiet, and usually safe, usually. The doors might be locked at night in big cities, but in rural parishes, you could ask the priest for permission, offer a blessing, and curl up in a pew or under one. You pull your cloak tighter and settle onto the stone floor, maybe using your sack of dried figs as a pillow. A nearby candle flickers behind stained glass. It smells like beeswax and incense. If you're very lucky, someone's left bread on the altar. If you're very, very lucky, there's a woolen cloth covering it, and you're bold enough to borrow it for a blanket. Now, this wasn't universally welcomed. Some clergy hated having vagabonds, pilgrims squatting in the nave. Others saw it as a duty of hospitality. After all, wasn't Mary and Joseph turned away from the inn? Better to host a sleepy stranger than play the villain in someone's nativity scene. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Was it reserved for feast days and long pilgrimages? Or did people casually nap in churches the way students do in libraries now? Either way, there are plenty of records showing churches as makeshift hostels, especially during large festivals or periods of chaos. And people didn't just sleep in churches. They snacked, they gossiped. They rearranged benches to make room for companions. One 13th century bishop even complained that pilgrims used the sacred font as a basin to wash their feet. Divine foot soak, anyone? Of course, sacred spaces had sacred boundaries. You couldn't just roll over and start snoring in front of the altar. And if you were caught, you might be fined or made to scrub the chapel steps in penance. But usually, as long as you were respectful, discreet, and didn't steal the communion wine, you were left in peace. Then there were the miracle chasers. Some people didn't sleep in churches for rest, but for revelation. It was called incubation, not the bird kind, the spiritual kind. You'd lie beside a saint's relics, praying for a vision, a dream, a sign. Maybe a healing, maybe just forgiveness. One woman reportedly slept for 3 nights beside the shrine of St. Edmund, hoping he'd cure her limp. He didn't, but she said he visited her dreams and told her to try walking anyway. She did. She limped less. Word spread. Pilgrimage traffic doubled. And let's not forget the professional sleepers, those employed to keep vigil. During big religious feasts, entire congregations might stay awake in shifts, praying, chanting, and occasionally nodding off mid-Hail Mary. Children fell asleep in their mothers' laps. Old men dozed against stone columns. Candles flickered. Faith, like sleep, came in waves, but sleep in churches wasn't all piety and candles. It could be cold, hard, echoey. The floor wasn't exactly forgiving. The wooden pews groaned under shifting weight. And yes, someone always snored, usually near the pulpit. You, tonight, are nestled against a side wall, cloaked and curled. A statue of St. Francis watches from above, holding a stone bird. The silence isn't complete. There's always a drip from somewhere. But it's enough, and in that silence, amid the shadows and flickers, you close your eyes. You're not at home. But you're not unwelcome. Just don't kick over the candle. You blink into the dark and feel it again, that soft orange flicker dancing across the wooden beams. The candle's still burning. You should have blown it out, but you didn't, because you were afraid of the dark. Or maybe you were reading something. Or maybe, let's be honest, you just fell asleep mid-prayer and forgot Dot in the medieval world. Candles were both friend and fire hazard. They brought light, warmth, comfort, but they also brought a very real risk of burning the entire house down while you dreamed about dancing bears or angry saints. Candles were made of tallow, rendered animal fat or beeswax if you were wealthy or religious. Beeswax burned cleaner and smelled better. Tallow? Not so much. Imagine sleeping beside a slow-burning hunk of bacon grease on a string. Still, you needed that candle for light, for timing, for a sense of safety in a very unsafe night. Some people used rushlight's long strips of dried rushes dipped in fat. They were cheaper than candles, but smoky, short-lived, and likely to sputter out just when you needed them most. Like, say, halfway through a scary dream about devils, or that time your neighbor cursed your chickens. And then there was the candle, clock-a time-keeping system involving a marked candle that burned down at a predictable rate. Monks used these to time prayers during the night. Some homes used them to gauge how long to sleep between first and second slumber. The idea was practical. The execution? A little risky, because unattended flames and flammable bedding are a bad mix. You're lying on straw, under wool, draped in fur, wrapped in fabric, soaked in who knows what. And you've got a candle burning inches away from your face. Historians still argue how often fires actually broke out due to bedtime candles. Some records suggest that entire villages burned because someone nodded off with a torch too close to the bed curtain. Others think people were more careful than we give them credit, for accidents happened. Sure, but folks weren't just stacking hay next to the sconce for fun. In monasteries, candles were strictly managed. Only designated monks could light them. They were snuffed out during certain prayers, and during Lent, many abbeys forbade light altogether after Compline forcing brothers to memorize their psalms in the dark or recite by moonlight. Sounds poetic. Was probably miserable, but in homes, especially poor ones, candles served more than one purpose. A single taper might light the room, warm the fingers, guide the bladder bound toward the chamber pot, and very occasionally burn low enough to mark the night's end. Some people believed candles helped protect them. Light kept evil spirits at bay. It was a kind of spiritual guard dog. Blowing it out meant inviting darkness, literal and metaphorical. That's why many people preferred to drift off with a stub of wax still glowing, even if it meant waking, up to the faint scent of singed blanket. And yes, let's not forget the bugs. Candles attracted moths, gnats, and beetles, all of which might drop unceremoniously onto your face as you doze. Nothing says blessed dreams like a beetle to the forehead. Still, for all the dangers, candles made the night human. Their glow softened stone walls. Their flicker brought comfort. They turned terrifying medieval shadows into manageable little corners of warmth. You, tonight, have one candle still lit. It leans slightly in the holder. The wax is puddled. It gives off a soft scent, maybe honey, maybe fat. You're watching it dim through half-lidded eyes. trying to remember whether you were supposed to pray again or just let yourself rest. Eventually, the wick will sputter. Maybe it'll gutter out on its own. Maybe it'll set your curtain smoldering. Maybe you'll wake in time to pat it down with the corner of your cloak. Who knows? But for now, it flickers. Steady, gentle dot, and you sleep. There's an iron charm nailed above the doorway, a sprig of rosemary tucked under your pillow, and you made sure, absolutely sure, your feet weren't pointing toward the door, because in the medieval world, sleep wasn't just rest, it was risk. Superstition wrapped itself around bedtime like a second blanket. There were rules. Not rules in the legal sense, but social, spiritual, deeply felt rituals meant to keep you safe while unconscious. Because once you surrendered to sleep, you weren't entirely in control, and that, understandably, freaked people out. Take the bed's direction, for example. Feet should never face the door. That's how corpses were carried out feet first, through the threshold and into the afterlife. Sleeping that way? Tempting. Fate. Or, at the very least, tempting some very bad dreams. You also shouldn't sleep with mirrors uncovered, in case your soul got confused while wandering during dreams. Or worse, something else looked back. And whatever you do, don't whistle. Near the bed, that supposedly calls spirits, or invites snakes, or both, depending on your village's folklore. Either way, hard pass. Historians still debate how widespread these beliefs were. Some claim they were more prevalent in rural communities, where folk traditions ran deep. Others argue that even educated nobles followed nighttime rituals because just in case always beats waking up cursed dot in any case. You never went to bed without some kind of protection. Many people placed iron objects near their bed nails, keys, scissors. Iron was believed to ward off spirits and fie. It was like medieval bug spray for the supernatural. Others drew protective symbols in chalk. Crosses, stars, circles. Some whispered prayers. Some muttered charms passed down from grandmothers who swore they'd once seen a banshee. And then there were the herbs. Lavender and rosemary for peaceful dreams. St. John's wort to repel evil. Mugwort if you were hoping for prophetic visions. People tucked them into sachets, laid them under pillows, even burned them before sleep like sleepy little bonfires dot in wealthier homes. A priest might bless the bed, especially if someone had recently died in it. Death left behind spiritual residue, according to popular belief, and nobody wanted to lie down in a haunted mattress. Just imagine trying to explain that rash as a ghost rash, not covered by the local apothecary. Some parents crossed their babies before bed, whispering blessings against the nightmare hag or Mara, a shadowy creature said to sit on your chest and steal your breath. This was the origin of the word nightmare, by the way, not just a bad dream. A bad dream with a visitor dot. There were also bedtime don'ts you had to memorize. Don't leave your shoes facing the wrong way. Don't eat cheese right before bed. Nightmares, obviously. Don't sleep with your mouth open. Souls might slip out or bugs might slip in either way. Unappealing closing parenthesis dot. And if you had a bad dream, you didn't just shake it off. You told someone, immediately, ideally before breakfast. Dreams were warnings, and ignoring them could bring misfortune. Or worse, mean the dream would come true. So people shared them, dissected them, prayed about them. The morning ritual wasn't, "How'd you sleep?" It was, "What did you see?" Still, for all the fear, these rituals offered comfort. They gave people control in a world full of uncertainty, and they bound families and communities together through shared belief. Tonight, reach for the dried bundle beside your bed. You press it beneath your pillow, just a bit of sage and thyme. Old habits. You don't really believe it'll help, but it doesn't hurt either. You lie back, careful not to cross your arms over your chest. That's corpse posture. After all, you adjust your shift. You breathe, and you sleep, knowing that above your bed is a crooked iron nail, hammered into the beam so long ago no one remembers why, except maybe just maybe. It's still working. You're wide awake, not because of a noise, not because of a draft, not even because someone tipped over the chamber pot again. You're awake because something's bothering you, not outside, inside. Annoying guilt, a sour feeling in your chest, an echo of something you shouldn't have said, shouldn't have done, shouldn't have thought. In the medieval world, this wasn't just insomnia. It was a warning from your soul. Sleep and sin were deeply intertwined. If you couldn't sleep, something was wrong, not with your mattress, which was already terrible, but with you, your spirit, your conscience. You're standing with God. People believed that sleep came from divine grace. If you were pure of heart, your sleep would be sweet, dreamless, undisturbed. But if you were sinning, even secretly, your sleep would betray you. Restlessness was moral feedback. Your neighbors knew it, too. Someone with dark circles and a bad mood in the morning, clearly guilty, clearly hiding something. You might get side-eyed at church, or worse, gossiped about over washing tubs. She hasn't slept since Whitsuntide. Must be something she did to her cousin's ox. Historians still argue whether people really internalized these ideas, or whether they were just repeated by clergy looking to sell more penance. Either way, the belief stuck, and not just in sermons. Confessors regularly asked about sleep during spiritual check-ins. Do you sleep soundly? Was a veiled way of asking, do you have secrets? If you said no, you'd better have a very innocent reason, like noisy neighbors, or an unusually loud goat. Sometimes people sought confession not because of guilt, but because of exhaustion. A few whispered sins and a quick blessing could cleanse the soul enough to allow sleep. Spiritual melatonin, if you will. Others took more physical steps. Flagellation, for example. Some monks whipped themselves before bed to punish sinful thoughts and invite God's mercy. Pain brought clarity, and eventually sleep. In less dramatic settings, folks tried prayers and charms. Psalms recited in a specific order. Rosaries said backward, not officially sanctioned, but desperate times. Or laying a blessed relic under the pillow to ward off torment. And if all that failed, well, maybe your bed was cursed. There were stories of beds that caused nightmares, restless limbs, even madness. If multiple people suffered sleepless nights in the same spot, that bed was often burned or, if expensive, just moved to the barn and given to a very unlucky cousin. There's a documented case of a merchant who blamed his insomnia on a rival's curse. He couldn't sleep for 3 weeks, had dreams of fire and drowning. eventually hired a wandering friar to cleanse his bedding. The friar burned some herbs, muttered in Latin, and slapped the mattress twice. The merchant slept like a baby that night. Coincidence? Possibly. But try telling him that Dot, and of course not all sleeplessness was spiritual. Sometimes you were hungry, injured, cold, or just extremely annoyed at the person next to you. But in a world where the physical and spiritual blurred constantly, everything had deeper meaning. You, tonight, stare at the ceiling or the thatched equivalent. You think of the harsh words you muttered at the market, the stolen apple, the way you meant to say that prayer but got distracted. Your eyes burn. Your legs twitch. You roll over. Eventually you whisper a few words just in case. Maybe a prayer, maybe an apology, maybe both. And slowly the guilt softens. Your breath evens out. You're not perfect, but maybe tonight that's okay, because even in the Middle Ages, mercy could be found under wool and straw and a crooked ceiling beam, and sleep uneven, lumpy, precious sleep comes at last. The candles burned out, the embers are cold. Somewhere nearby a rooster thinks about crowing, but isn't quite there yet. You shift beneath your blanket or what passes for one, and blink into the murky blue of early morning. But you don't. Rise. Not yet. You've just completed your second sleep. Yes, we're back to that again. Because while the first sleep came early, thick and heavy like a woolen cloak, the second sleep was different. Lighter, dreamier, sometimes more anxious, sometimes more peaceful. And as the sun rose over medieval Europe, it began to fade first in your mind, then in your bones. You feel it now, that odd sensation. Not rested, but not entirely tired. You're in the gray zone between sleep and waking, where the world feels distant and the body moves slowly, as though underwater. The first thing you notice is sound. Someone's shifting nearby. A cart rumbles past outside. A bell rings faintly in the chapel tower, not the urgent clang of matins, but the gentler call of prime or terce. If you're lucky, there's a fire being kindled in another room. If you're really lucky, someone's already boiling water for porridge. This second sleep, the one you just emerged from, is something modern life forgot. But for most of human history, it was normal. The two sleeps model structured everything: meals, chores, intimacy, even crime. Medieval court records show crimes often happened between first and second sleep, when people were awake, but the town was not. Think of it as the Middle Ages version of 3 a.m. doom scrolling. Historians still argue why this natural rhythm faded. Some point to the rise of artificial light, candles, lamps, eventually gaslight and electric bulbs that stretched the day and compressed the night. Others blame industrialization. Factories demanded early rising, and sleep needed to become efficient, uninterrupted, obedient. Either way, the second sleep slowly vanished. By the 19th century, it had become a curiosity. People no longer expected to wake in the night. If they did, they called it insomnia. Strange, isn't it? What used to be sacred time, an hour for dreams, prayer, quiet talk, became a problem to be fixed with pills, tea, or podcasts about boring medieval sleep habits. Yes, like this one. You stretch now, slowly. Your limbs are stiff, your mouth dry, but the fear has faded. The dreams, however strange, are gone, and in their place is something quieter, not quite clarity, but rest, and that's something. You roll to one side and watch the faintest edge of morning spill through the window slats. It's gray, misty, probably raining again, but the world is starting up, one pot of porridge and one rattling cart at a time. No one speaks yet. That will come later. For now, people just move. Someone braids their hair. Someone stirs the coals. Someone whispers a prayer. And maybe someone turns over for just 5 more minutes. The most ancient tradition of all dot. So you close your eyes one last time. Not for sleep, exactly, but to hold on to the stillness a moment longer. The room grows softer. The shapes around you blur, shadows stretching and blending into the floor. Your breath is slow now, steady. Even the goat in the corner has stopped, shifting. You feel the rough edge of linen beneath your fingers, the heavy warmth of the wool draped over your legs, the whisper of cold air sneaking in through a crack in the wall, but it's gentle now, not biting. Just enough to remind you that you're here, you're safe, and the night is nearly done. Outside. The first birds start to stir, not quite singing, just rustling, testing the branches. The world hasn't begun yet, but it's close. You can sense it, like a tide pulling in, like breath drawing back. And you don't have to rise yet. This is your moment. This in-between space, this soft, sacred pause between the old day and the new, between dark and light, between dream and memory. Listen to the silence, to your heartbeat, to the hush of air through the room. And as your eyes drift closed again just lightly, not all the way, you carry with you the stillness of the medieval night. The flicker of candlelight, the weight of fur, the muffled bells, the breathing of those nearby, and for once the strange rhythm of broken, crowded, superstition-soaked sleep doesn't feel so strange after all. It just feels human. Sweet dreams.